All right, everybody, if you can grab your seats, there's plenty of open ones up in front. But thank you very much, everybody, for taking time to come here tonight. Welcome to the Johnson Center, the Hoover Institution's outpost in Washington, D.C. We welcome you all here. We're very glad that you came to discuss a new report that National Affairs has just published titled Unleashing Opportunity. It's a 3-volume series that Yuval will discuss, but tonight's discussion is Policy Reforms for an Accountable Administrative State. Before I introduce our speakers, let me cross-sell a little bit and just mention a couple other upcoming events we'll have here. On January 26th, next week, we're going to have a discussion on immigration titled Immigration Facts, Migrants, Walls, Refugees, and Enforcement. It's going to be a discussion of the 2015 Yearbook of Immigration Statistics from the Department of Homeland Security. That will feature Mark Rosenblum, Deputy Assistant Secretary and Director of the Office of Immigration Statistics. He'll be discussing the report with Tim Kaine, who's the J.P. Kant Fellow in Immigration Studies here at Hoover. And then a little further down the road on February 1st, the Lawfare Project, the Hoover Institution's National Security, Technology, and Law Working Group, will have the latest installment in its ongoing series of book discussions. This time, the book in question is Edward J. Epstein's How America Lost Its Secrets, Edward Snowden, the Man and the Theft. That'll be on February 1st, so we welcome you to those and all the other events we have here. But tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce 3 friends and co-authors with whom we've worked on this project. Again, Policy Reforms for an Accountable Administrative State. Let me just go down the line before turning things over to Yuval. But our first speaker, after we introduce things, will be Kevin Kosar. Kevin is a senior fellow at the R Street Institute, where he also serves as director of the Institute's governance project, where he tries to make Congress great again, as they like to say. He's an expert on Congress's role in our government and our politics. In fact, he had an up-close view of Congress for several years as research manager and analyst at the Congressional Research Service, an agency within the Library of Congress that advises congressmen and committees on a range of legislative issues. His research has been widely published in a number of journals and books, but of all of his writings, my favorite might be his 2010 book, Whiskey, A Global History, to be followed in a few months by his next book titled Moonshine, A Global History. But tonight he'll be discussing the Constitution's first branch, Congress. Seated next to him is Oren Cass, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Oren focuses on energy, the environment, and the social safety net. In 2015, Politico recognized him as one of the 50 thinkers, doers, and visionaries transforming American politics for his work as, quote, the conservative poverty crusader. Hope that doesn't mean you crusade for conservative, impoverished conservatives. But,
or wage a crusade on the impoverished.
You can find his transformational writings in National Affairs, City Journal, the Wall Street Journal, and many other publications. Before joining the Manhattan Institute, he was domestic policy director of Mitt Romney's presidential campaign in 2011 and 2012. After graduating from Harvard Law School, where he was vice president of the Harvard Law Review, Oren was a management consultant for Bain & Company in Boston and New Delhi. Tonight, he'll apply the tools of his management consultant trade to the Constitution's second branch, the executive branch. And finally, our moderator tonight is Yuval Levin, founder and editor of National Affairs and the Hertog Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Before joining EPPC, Yuval served on the White House domestic policy staff under George W. Bush, and he was executive director of the President's Council on Bioethics, and before that, a congressional staffer. He's the author of several great books, including The Great Debate, his study of Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine, and more recently, The Fractured Republic, his study of the history that brought us to our rather interesting political moment. And that's what we're here to discuss tonight, or at least one part of that interesting political moment, the modern administrative state. Let me just begin with the opening words of our report, which try to capture what we're grappling with. The modern administrative state reflects a fundamental failure of Republican self-governance. Over the course of decades, the federal government's 3 constitutional branches ceded ever more power to administrative agencies. Their legacy is a nation governed disproportionately, even predominantly, by the agencies. To remedy this will require a concerted recommitment to Republican governance by all 3 branches, Congress, the presidency, and the judiciary, and most of all, by the people themselves. Now, this project began as a discussion, or the research for it began as a discussion that was hosted by the Hillsdale Center, or Hillsdale College's Kirby Center here in Washington, D.C. And at that discussion, Matt Spalding, who directs the center, really put the point well. He said, the administrative state isn't just a theoretical problem to be reasoned through. It's not an abstraction. It's a practical crisis. It's a practical crisis in which Congress has year after year given agencies immense power, and the agencies wield that power. And to solve it, you can't just reason through it as an abstraction or even a legal abstraction, as lawyers like me are wont to do. Rather, you have to deal with it as a very real political problem, a governance problem. Now, discussions of the modern administrative state have accelerated in the last 8 years or so. But the problems that we're grappling with in this report didn't begin with President Obama. They're not just his doing. They long precede him. In many respects, the Obama administration's agencies reflect the culmination of certain trends or qualitative changes in some long-standing trends. But those agencies didn't create this problem. Not even recent Congress has created this problem. It long predates them. So when we see things in the last 8 years, like the president saying, I have a pen and I have a phone, and when Congress won't act, I will, those might seem stark sort of exaggerations of problems we've grappled with in a long time, but they are just the continuation of things that long predate this now closing administration. Trends that began not just with Democratic presidencies, Democrats and Republican presidents and Congresses alike ceding ever more authority to administrative agencies. And as we note in the report, the modern administrative state almost has a corrosive effect or a gravitational pull on our politics. It's the result of our politics, but then it also affects politics going forward. When a president knows that he can tackle certain policies unilaterally through his agencies, then there's much less commitment to the legislative process. And by the same token, when his opponents in Congress know that the president can walk away from the table and do things on his own, it decreases their commitment to, or their incentives for committing to a real legislative process. Now, there are various measures of the growth of the administrative state in recent years, and we offer some in the report, but I think it's best summed up recently in 2013 Supreme Court opinion by Chief Justice Roberts, where he says, quote, the administrative state wields vast power and touches almost every aspect of daily life. The framers could hardly have envisioned today's vast and varied federal bureaucracy and the authority administrative agencies now hold over our economic, social, and political activities. The administrative state, with its reams of regulations, would leave the framers rubbing their eyes. I think that's true. But as we note, all three branches created this problem, and thus all three must contribute to its remedy. And the goal in all of this, as we'll discuss tonight, isn't to end agencies. It's not to end regulation. Rather, it's to improve the work of the agencies, to make them more accountable, more Republican in the lower R sense, more accountable to the people and to the three branches of government. Not to kill the agencies, but to improve the work, the practical governance that actually comes from them. So that was the problem as we diagnosed it at the outset of this. And we had the opportunity to write about these issues and from the vantage point of all three branches, thanks to a project of National Affairs and Yuval Levin. Yuval had invited us to do this. And so let me turn this over to Yuval now for him to discuss the broader project and put this report in context.
All right, thank you very much, Adam, and thanks to everybody for being here. It's wonderful to see on a rainy Tuesday that you can draw people to think about this problem, and it's a great time for it. As Adam says, I'm editor of National Affairs. I'll say a few words about National Affairs and about the broader project that this is part of, and then we can start a little conversation here about what's in the report and why and how. National Affairs is a quarterly journal of essays about public policy and political ideas. I hope you all know it. Many people here have written for us. Several people here owe me an essay, and I won't let you leave before that's settled. We've been a platform in the last few years for developing policy thinking in healthcare and education, in welfare, entitlement reform, and beyond that, a lot of which is already shaping the policy agenda clearly of the coming years, and more of it we hope will. Over the past year in particular, with help from the Cyril Freedom Trust, and thanks in particular to the efforts of our managing editor at National Affairs, Emily McLean, who's here, we've convened 3 working groups of experts to provide some detailed guidance to the next administration before we knew what it would be, to the next administration and the next Congress, in 3 areas that we have thought would be particularly important to helping Americans thrive in the 21st century. And those are innovation policy, regulatory policy, and higher education policy. In each case, we've had a small group working for about a year or so to put together a brief book of ideas that really get into the weeds some and that might give some guidance to the new administration and the Congress. We're making sure their work is reaching the new administration and the Congress, but we also wanted to inform the public conversation, and hence events like this one. The innovation book, the first in the series, was released just 2 weeks ago. I have one here, and they're available on our website. They're available on Amazon for 99 cents, worth every penny. And tonight we're releasing this second book. The first was on innovation policy, a working group run for us by Jim Manzi that put together really a fantastic report that I think will be enormously useful. This project on the administrative state was run for us by Adam, and Adam had the opportunity just now to introduce all of us. I should introduce Adam a little bit. He's done a tremendous job on this, and it hasn't surprised any of us. Adam, as you know, is a research fellow here at the Hoover Institution. He's also, I think, really one of the most important rising legal and constitutional thinkers on the contemporary right. He writes very widely on the courts, on the administrative state, on the Constitution. He's a contributing editor at National Affairs, most importantly. And this report really gives you a sense of the kind of work that he does, which is to try to put a lot of the arguments that we often hear made in ways that are at once too abstract and too detailed, and try to give them a kind of frame that helps them make sense in our contemporary circumstances. I think this particular report does that enormously well. It's structured like the Constitution. It is about how getting back to a working system would mean getting back the order, the structure, the shape of our constitutional system. And in that sense, it is really about the 3 branches of government and how they ought to work together. The argument of the report, it seems to me, stepping back from it a little bit, is that the trouble with the administrative state is a failure of all 3 branches of government to assert their authority within its proper boundaries. And you almost have to walk through every word of that sentence to see exactly the scope of the problem. Because it's not simply that the administrative state is too strong or too assertive or too ambitious. It's that the shape it takes means that the branches of government are not strong enough in their own appropriate realms. And in a sense, we have both hyperactivity and underactivity, making it difficult for our system to function. And what's called for now is a rebalancing of the constitutional system. This is ultimately an argument for balance, which I think is the genius of our constitutional system. So maybe in talking about it, we'll just work through the chapters and see what questions open up before us. We'll start appropriately, I think, with the Congress, where it all begins. And so we'll start with Kevin, who has been wise enough to know over the years that if you're going to be a real scholar of the Congress, you also have to be a real scholar of alcohol.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for having me here. Yes, I got to spend a decade working at Congressional Research Service, which is a nonpartisan, expert-based group inside the Library of Congress, and I had a chance to work with many committees, many members, hundreds and hundreds of staffers, and it was a marvelous education. If anybody knows a young JD or PhD who's looking to get a Hill education, that is certainly one place where you can get it, and many folks make a career of it. But I, a couple years ago, hopped over to R Street Institute in order to be able to do some new things, and being able to write for National Affairs is one of the great things I've been able to do. It's a lot of fun. And so I certainly won't recapitulate the whole chapter to you. You're too decent an audience for that. So let me just give some limited comments about the way I kind of look at the problem, which is ultimately from a separation of powers congressional perch. Our Constitution's Article 1, Section 1 declares that all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States. And if that isn't sufficiently clear, it also later adds that Congress shall have the power to make rules for the government and the regulation of the land and naval forces, civilian and military. It can make rules for all. Congress. Our founders plainly wanted a national legislature to be the first branch, the wellspring of governmental reach and governmental power. Yet as we all recognize, what we have today bears little resemblance to what James Madison, George Washington, and others intended to create in 1789. Today, the executive branch is a behemoth, an incomprehensible behemoth. It's about $4 trillion a year in funds that flow through it, 160 or more executive agencies approximately, 4 million employees, and untold millions of others toiling for it as contractors. And I said 160 agencies approximately because we honestly don't have an authoritative count of how many executive branch agencies exist, which is symptomatic of the situation. Meanwhile, the legislative branch has a budget of about $4.5 billion, a budget that has been flat for many years now. And this budget, mind you, is not just Congress itself. It includes the architect of the Capitol, GAO, Library of Congress, et cetera, et cetera. Not much money for an entire branch, but that's what it has. Strangely, Congress has gleefully shoveled more money to the executive branch year after year, but kept its own budget flat, while decreasing its cohort of staff and experts on call at agencies like my former one, CRS. Less money, fewer people, yet the other branch, it keeps growing. Kind of insane, wouldn't you say? Congress, beyond the money and the manpower issue, has further diminished its power vis-a-vis the executive branch over the last century through delegation. Delegation has come in a variety of forms, simply not asserting itself in various realms of policy. But a lot of the delegation has come in the form of handing off regulatory authority, rulemaking authority. Consider the contrast in legislative activity, since rules are, of course, miniature laws. Congress enacts perhaps 50 significant laws per year. When you scrape out the post office renamings and the National Watermelon Week and all that sort of stuff, and look at real laws, about 50 significant laws per year. Executive agencies issue 3,000, 4,000 new rules per year, 80 to 100 of which are major ones, which have effects of $100 million or more. Who's the real legislator in our modern constitutional system? Is it the Congress or is it the executive branch? Meanwhile, the Code of Federal Regulations, the corpus of current agency rules, or mini laws, runs 175,000 plus pages. Just this past Friday, the issue of the Federal Register had more than 620 pages in it. Not all of it was new regulations, but much of it was. If you imagine yourself as a congressman or a congressional staffer, even worse, try to think how you could possibly keep up with that crush. We have a part-time legislature that's here for about half the year. Staff are here, fortunately, full-time. But the executive branch is a machine that runs of its own, 24 hours a day, doing what it does. And therein you could see the divergent flight paths of the two branches, the legislative and the executive branch. James Madison, endlessly remarkable man, warned of the perils of big government. Who would have thought back then when government was so tiny, but he imagined what could happen if government got too large. He wrote that the extension of the federal powers to every subject falling within the idea of the general welfare would have ill effects. Inevitably, one consequence must be to enlarge the sphere of discretion allotted to the magistrate. Basic math and finite congressional capacity were the reasons. Quote, in proportion as the objects of legislative care might be multiplied, the time allotted for each would be diminished. Less brain to put on each task. Guess who's got more brains to put on it? The executive branch. Guess who's going to win the policy arguments and make the rules? So here we are with an administrative state that runs of its own and a Congress that plays very little meaningful role in regulatory policy on a day-to-day basis. Its involvement tends to be episodic. And as my friend from Brookings and co-author Philip Wallach noted in a piece for National Affairs earlier this autumn, Congress's role frequently in regulatory policy is dysfunctional. It's to assume that it's the executive branch's job and to flap its arms and sputter and yell epithets when the executive branch does something that it doesn't like. But then the rules remain and nothing changes. Unwittingly, we are finding ourselves slipping into this kind of expert-led executive government that John Stuart Mill imagined in 1861 in his Considerations on Representative Government, wherein Essentially, the policy making, that's the executive branch. In the legislature, its job is pretty much to blow off steam rising up from vox populi. This, I submit, is probably not what we want, certainly not what I would imagine this crowd is in favor of. If we prefer a democratic republic, we have no choice but to reassert Congress in regulatory policy. Now, the other day somebody asked me, well, if Congress gets involved in regulation, won't that politicize it? And I said, well, yes, it'll make it more political, but it'll make it more pluralistically political. Right now, regs are already political. They're not antiseptic, purely devised by experts. No, it's political, but it's a limited political game. Getting Congress back in is going to expand the political circle. It'll make it more pluralistic, make it more democratic, and more accountable. Now, how do we get there? Certainly, we could have Congress, the chamber leaders in the House and the Senate, devote more calendar time to voting on regulations. Use the Congressional Review Act more frequently. Ask committees to pay more attention to regulation. Make it the subject of communication on an ongoing basis. Get members to see the truth that is so often forgotten, which is all regulations are local. That's where they have their bite. That's where they have their effect. Whether it's in the factory producing dishwashers, on the folks who are working farms, school teachers in classrooms. I mean, how much of the rage driven against the No Child Left Behind Act, which, teachers unions were very much on board with changing it, was because of regulations which were kind of directing teachers how to do what they do and administrators how to run their schools. Regulations hit everything. It's not just a business issue, and leaders in both chambers need to remind their members to talk about that. But exhortations are not enough. We need a Madisonian series of responses to create structural change, to get Congress back into game and to create a bit more balance. And in the report, I offer a variety of ideas, and I'll just touch on 4 of them. First is that Congress can staff up a BRAC-like commission to just start going through that mass of regulations in the Code of Federal Regulations and looking for the failed regs, the anachronistic ones, the ones that just don't have a point anymore. Put them all together in a package, vote them up or down. Make it a bipartisan exercise so everybody can have buy-in to it. Second, enacting the REINS Act, which the House has already done, I believe, 4 times. This basically flips the toggle on really big rules. Instead of agencies just being able to do it and kind of saying Congress, well, tough, suck it up, Congress would have to affirmatively act and vote for such regulations to take place. Again, we need Congress to realize that they're responsible for this. And one way we can make them feel responsible for it is make them vote on it. Third, Congress can go for a regulatory budget. Not a new idea. It's been kicking around for many years, as the gentleman in the back there against the window can tell you all. Regulatory budgeting is not some sort of crazy right-wing idea. Canada has a regulatory budget. One of Canada's provinces has a regulatory budget. It's doable. It's a way to rein in the administrative state. And finally, to increase Congress's capacity in its battle against the executive branch, because this is not some sort of tea party, in the sense of a pleasant tea party, Congress needs more brain power. And my co-author, Philip Wallach, and I proposed a Congressional Regulatory Office modeled on CBO. The idea is that the regulatory state is so immense, so complex, and there are new rules coming out constantly which are bewilderingly difficult to understand and are very, very technical in many cases. You need a core of experts who get paid to spend time looking at these things, writing cost-benefit analyses to check agencies' own self-interested math, alerting members of Congress that these rules are coming down the pipeline, and serving as an all-purpose resource for Congress to give it the brain power and the capacity so that it can actually engage the behemoth. The Constitution, go back to Article 1, gives Congress all the tools it needs to staff itself up and to strengthen itself. And now it's just a matter of it doing it. And I'm hoping we're at a peculiar moment in time when the stars align and we can get real regulatory reform on Capitol Hill. The House already has passed reg reform bills, and who knows, perhaps the Senate will take them up and our new president will sign them. We'll see.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Oren?
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for coming. As Adam mentioned, I'm a recovering management consultant, but every now and then we learn something interesting, and some of it even applies to government. I think one of the most important things I learned was that organizations produce decisions. That when you're evaluating how well an organization works, the question is how does it make its decisions? And when you're trying to improve one, you don't improve it by moving boxes around on a page, you improve it by putting the right decisions in the right places. And to the credit of the policy community, we are obsessed with decisions, not with boxes. Every now and then you'll hear about a plan to reorganize government, and we're going to combine these agencies and break these agencies apart and get rid of this one. I think everyone understands that's not the way to actually make the federal government work better at this point. Not to our credit, the decision-making process we have set up within the executive branch is the somewhere between stupidest and craziest possible design for actually getting good decisions out of our administrative state. And so what I really wanted to focus on, and I go through in my chapter, is the idea that fixing the administrative state isn't a matter of ripping things out of the executive branch and putting them back in Congress or back in the judiciary. Certainly there are components of that, but there's also a tremendous amount of mileage we can get out of actually making the executive branch function properly. And that should actually be a very bipartisan effort. The hypothesis is not that if we made the administrative state work better, we would therefore get our small government that we really want. To the extent that it's better policy, we should expect to get it over time. But we should also recognize that an administrative state that worked better would work better for the sake of whomever is in power. And we should embrace that if our goal is actually to return to Republican self-government, that means giving the people the power to implement whatever set of policies and whatever approach to government they might want. So today, I think the question of how the executive branch actually functions gets caught up in a tremendous number of fairly strange questions, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the fact that no one's in charge. And we actually seem to like it that way. The other branches like it that way. We've reached this very strange equilibrium where the judiciary and Congress feel comfortable dumping more and more power into the executive branch on the assumption that the executive branch is too screwed up to really use it very effectively. We're going to delegate power to this agency, to this secretary, to this independent commission. We're going to have all of these different forms of oversight and so on and so forth. And no one's ever going to really have the power to pull that together and do anything with it. That's really the theory I would say that things are built on. In response, you've seen the president try to assert some limited authority over the past few decades, particularly with OIRA. But the reality is that it's been a half measure in the extreme, that OIRA, at the end of the day, doesn't claim any actual authority. It does some combination of review, oversight, collaboration, coordination. Every executive order on OIRA explicitly disavows the right to actually tell anybody what to do. And I think that is one of the original sins of the administrative state, and the way to fix it is actually quite straightforward, and something that we actually have a president-elect now who might be very much inclined to do, which is to just assert that the president is in fact in charge. That any delegation of authority into the executive branch is one that the president has the authority to wield. And it can be as straightforward as the president saying that any rule that's going to be published in the Federal Register needs to be signed by the president. Now, we could have a very long legal and constitutional debate about whether or not the president can do that. I think the case that he can is actually quite straightforward. And it's that we all agree that the president has the removal power. And we all agree that the president has power over budgets to some extent within the agencies. With our legal hats on, we then get into very nuanced debates over, well, but what does that mean for direction versus oversight versus something else, because we like the idea that somehow courts can order things to happen. In the private sector, we don't question that the CEO of an organization has directive authority over that organization. In fact, he has only the exact set of authorities that the president already has. A CEO who wants something done, we have a legal fiction that he can direct it be done. He can't really direct it be done. All he can do is ask one of his subordinates to see that it gets done. And if it doesn't, all that he can do is demote them, cut their budgets, or fire them. If a marketing plan that comes up that he doesn't like, he can't seek an injunction for a better marketing plan. He can send it back and say no and change the person in charge of the marketing plan. And those are the powers that the president already has. And if we do away with the fiction that he doesn't actually have the power to control what happens in the executive branch, the most important thing that would happen is it would completely change the function that OIRA could play. That if you actually asserted that the president controls the rulemaking process within the executive branch, then OIRA would go from being this strange shadow faux oversight organization to effectively being the chief operating officer of the administrative state. OIRA would be the place where you would locate the resources and the expertise and the control and decision making of how rules happen. It would mean OIRA would control the regulatory agenda. OIRA would control priorities, and OIRA could control a regulatory budget. I agree with Kevin that ideally Congress would ultimately set a regulatory budget, but we also have to be realistic that Congress can't even set a fiscal budget very well right now, and that a president who wanted to defy a congressional regulatory budget would have any number of tools to do so. But a president who sets a regulatory budget, first of all, has the capacity to do it, and second of all, can back it up. If the president through OIRA says, here's how much rulemaking we're going to have in each agency this year, it's going to be positive, it's going to be neutral, it might be negative, that's both a decision with a substantial amount of political salience, and it's a decision that can be backed up, and it's a decision that completely changes the calculus for how agencies would then behave, how seriously they would take retrospective review of what they already have on the books, and how they would dedicate their time to new rules. If you had OIRA in charge, OIRA would also be the expert on cost-benefit analysis. Instead of the agencies possessing that expertise, always with a focus on promoting the largest possible expansion of their power, OIRA would have it, and certainly to the extent an administration wanted to be pro-regulatory could do so, but an administration that didn't want to could check that power just as well. And finally, OIRA would be the center of what I would call regulatory industrial complex. There's a huge network of academic scholars, of private sector consultancies, whose entire purpose is to produce studies supporting what agencies want to do. EPA funds an enormous amount of research. The number one thing they fund is studies on how high the benefits of their regulations are. That's not a bad thing to know, but we can guess what those studies are going to say. If OIRA were the main contractor with outside parties and funder and decision maker on that type of research, you would get a much more balanced view of what regulation is actually doing. And you would get a focus on the longer run effect. So you would expect to see a lot more focus on trade-offs faced by the private sector, by the costs of regulations versus the benefits, and you could even build directly into rules tests of how well they're working out. I think if there were to be a criticism of this approach, there would be two. One is, well, now we're making the president even more powerful. And I think it's important to recognize that this only works in the context of the reforms that Kevin and Adam are talking about in their respective branches, and that you would expect it to happen that way. That if the president actually asserted this authority and declared that, in fact, the decision to make a new rule is a political decision, that Congress would have to rethink what kind of authority it wants to dump in there. Either be more specific, potentially give single-serve delegations to ask that a new rule be made, but not give infinite power to every president forever to then go make any other rule he also wants. And you would expect the judiciary to give significantly less deference to decisions that we're now being clear are in fact political decisions, not antiseptic technocratic ones on the merits. The second concern that you have at first potentially is, well, then what do agencies do? Right? We have come to think of agencies as rule makers, as that being their function in the executive branch. The reality is that that is not the job of agencies. The job of agencies is to do all of the things an executive branch is actually supposed to do. I wrote down a list. Things like gathering information, monitoring compliance, issuing permits, enforcement, adjudication, actual day-to-day operations, keeping the national parks open. That's why we actually have an executive branch, and the president would not want to and could not direct any of that himself. And if you told agencies to actually focus on that and to provide their technical expertise when you need it in the context of a rulemaking, you would restore them to their proper place. And you would recognize that rulemaking, to the extent it needs to exist, is a political decision that's going to be made by the politically accountable component of the executive branch. And so that is one way that we could help rein in the administrative state.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the last section we looked at were the courts, the relationship between courts and agencies. And actually, we tried to tackle two things. I mean, there's the way that the courts review the work of agencies, but that's really intertwined tightly with what happens inside of the agencies themselves, for reasons I'll get to in a minute. But basically, when the courts are looking at the work of agencies, they're evaluating two things. They're evaluating the processes that the agency went through, making sure that the agency actually complied with the procedural requirements that Congress has placed on them. And then they're also making sure that in substance, the agency has stayed within the limits set by laws like the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act or the Telecommunications Act. That basic body of law, the way that agencies interact with courts, is known as administrative law. A lot of law is boring. Administrative law might actually be the most boring of all. Welcome, I'm here to talk about it. There's a famous line from Justice Scalia in a 1989 article. He said, "Administrative law is not for sissies, so you should lean back, clutch the sides of your chairs, and steel yourselves for a pretty dull lecture." And that's basically how administrative law has been seen for a very long time, which is why, to my amazement, in recent years, administrative law has actually taken on a much sort of, it's taken up much more attention in our political debates, the interactions between the courts and the agencies. And I think that's symptomatic of the moment we're in. The fact that so many people care about doctrines like Chevron deference, which I'll talk about in a second, shows that the administrative state really has taken on an outsized role in our politics. I mean, there's this basic sense, as I said earlier, that agencies make hugely significant legal and policy decisions, but it's more than that. It's that the agencies are making these hugely impactful decisions with little or no process, at least with insufficient process, and certainly not the checks and balances that are built into the Constitution. I mean, a good example of this is what's known as informal rulemaking. In the administrative law, the basic fundamental part of administrative law is known as the Administrative Procedure Act. It's from 1946. It set up two types of rulemaking. Formal rulemaking, where you'd have real hearings and cross-examination, almost like a court, and then informal rulemaking for the really simple stuff. Except for the past 4 or 5 decades, we've done almost everything through informal rulemaking. Whether it's the net neutrality rules or the Clean Power Plan, or take what you will, it's these hugely impactful rulemakings that are done through what's known as informal rulemaking, as if it's the sort of thing you just sort of dash off in a hurry. And that's the most process you get. Even worse is what's taken on increasing visibility is known as guidance documents, where the agency doesn't even go through these minimal hoops of notice and comment, announcing a rule they want to do and then taking public comment and then going ahead more or less with the rule they wanted to do in the first place. That's informal rulemaking. Even more than that, now agencies are using guidance documents that don't go through even those hoops. The agency just announces, here's how we interpret our own rules, here's how we interpret a statute, you ought to comply with it going forward. And even though these documents aren't formally binding, and the agency will even say, this isn't formally binding, everybody knows it's easiest just to go along with it rather than pick a fight, because you don't want to wind up in court, you don't want to anger a regulator with whom you're a repeat player, you have a long-standing course of a relationship with the regulator. And so you have this breakdown inside the agencies where they're doing so much through so little process or no process at all. And at the same time, when it gets to the courts, after the agency's work is done, judicial review seems far too minimalistic. There's doctrines like Chevron deference, where if an agency is interpreting an ambiguous statute, the courts are going to defer to the agency's interpretation as long as it's reasonable. So there's some curbs on this, but they're not exactly strenuous. And this is a doctrine that's 30 years old. It came up in the context of the Reagan administration. It was somewhat controversial from the beginning, but it's especially controversial now, and to borrow again the example of, say, the Communications Act, where the FCC proposes a whole system for net neutrality regulations based on more or less a statute that was written in 1934. And it takes broadly worded phrases from 8 decades ago, and then says to the court, well, that's close enough, right? These words are so broad, and the court more or less says yes. And so, as I mentioned in this last chapter of this report, sometimes you get both these problems at once. There was a really interesting case in the Supreme Court a few years ago called Perez, where the Labor Department made a really, it flipped 180 degrees on a pretty important labor policy, just as the preceding administration did and the administration before that. Administration after administration, that Labor Department would just flip back and forth on a policy about overtime and other benefits for a certain class of employees. There was no process or anything. The agency just announced, we're reinterpreting this. And when it went to the Supreme Court, it was challenged. Critics said, you need to go through more process before you make this policy change under some precedents. And the Supreme Court said, no, you don't. The Administrative Procedure Act exempts this class of rulemakings from notice and comment requirements. But the troubling part about this was there was no process in the agency, but there was really no judicial review either, because under these deference doctrines, the courts were directed to defer to the agency's interpretation. And the agency knew that. They even said in the context of the litigation, courts, you should treat our interpretation as controlling. So there was no process in the agency. There was really no protection of judicial review. And even though the Supreme Court signed off on this, because it really pretty clearly had to under the Administrative Procedure Act, a number of justices were troubled by this, by the absence of process at the front end and the back end. And not just conservatives like Justice Scalia and Justice Alito and Chief Justice Roberts, but even Justice Kagan, an expert on administrative law, even she sort of expressed concerns at oral argument that the agency was trying to have it both ways, saying that what the agency was doing wasn't so important as to require process in the agency, but at the same time, it's so binding that the court shouldn't shouldn't reconsider the agency's legal interpretation. Now, like I said, all this comes back to the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946. A 70-year-old, 80-year-old statute. I did my math wrong. No, a 70-year-old statute that that Congress, in the aftermath of World War II, but also in the aftermath of the first New Deal and this sort of reinvigoration of a 20th century administrative state, set up a series of procedures and standards for judicial review that basically reflected the administrative state as it existed in 1946. And so in this last essay here, in this book, I urge that the APA should be reformed sort of in the same spirit as the original framers of the APA of 1946. Grapple with administrative reality. Grapple with the administrative state as it currently exists, not as it existed in 1946 or 1976, and not as we see it sort of theoretically in law school case books. Actually look at what the agencies are doing now without any process, with such expansive powers, and try to reframe the Administrative Procedure Act to reflect that reality, just like the New Dealers did in 1946. And in all of this, it's not about dictating outcomes. The policies, the reforms I suggest in this, they don't dictate any specific outcomes. They don't say agencies can't do something or must do something in terms of substantive ends. It just tries to readjust the framework, the hoops that the agencies have to go through. Right now in behavioral economics, there's a famous book called Nudge by Cass Sunstein, where the idea is the job of government isn't to force people into particular outcomes and make their decisions for them. It's just to try to re-engineer what they would call the choice architecture. Make sure people are thinking through blind spots, looking around corners they don't normally look around before they make incredibly impactful decisions. That's called the nudge theory. And my approach to that then is, well, who will nudge the nudgers? It has to be the courts and it has to be Congress in setting up a modern administrative law. There's lots of proposals for this, one of which has already been discussed tonight, the Reins Act, which would put more accountability on Congress before the biggest rules are enacted. Another very important bill, one that I endorse in my essay, is called the Regulatory Accountability Act. I think it's the most important of all of the proposed reforms because it really would adjust the Administrative Procedure Act, especially for the most impactful rules, to force agencies to have a more open process, to have more notice at the front end, more opportunities for people to comment, not just on paper, floods of e-filings that the agency never really has to seriously think about, but actual in-person hearings where the regulators and their experts are confronted with challengers and their experts. Because as we've seen in court, sometimes the adversarial process, or real adversarial process, is what actually helps improve fact-finding and outcomes. But in addition to endorsing the Regulatory Accountability Act, I have a few other little tweaks I'll just go through very briefly. I mean, the key to the Regulatory Accountability Act is more procedural rigor inside of the agencies, more rounds of notice and comment, more transparency. Now, the criticism of those reforms, time and time again, especially from administrative law scholars, is that if you put more burdens on an agency will just find ways to avoid those. They won't go through the rulemaking process. They'll make policy through guidance. I mean, it's an interesting presumption, that, especially for administrative law scholars who like agencies, to assume that agencies are all basically bad actors who, when confronted with legal requirements, will try to evade them by making policy through other means. I mean, it's an interesting critique, but it's not inconsequential. I mean, sometimes agencies are bad actors, and sometimes if you put more burdens on them procedurally, they will try to evade them. And so I think the key then is to try to create incentives that will get agencies to do the right thing. Create incentives that will pull agencies in the right direction in spite of other incentives. And I think key to that is judicial deference. Right now, the judicial deference doctrines are out there basically for any rulemaking, for most adjudications. They're out there. The agency knows that if it makes a decision, it's going to get deference. Well, I propose in this report to eliminate judicial deference. Congress should outlaw judicial deference, as it's proposed to do in the Separation of Powers Restoration Act. But don't eliminate it altogether. Eliminate judicial deference except for the rules that go through the actual rulemaking process. So that if an agency wants to bypass the notice and comment process or heightened requirements that are imposed by the Regulatory Accountability Act, it can do that to some extent, but it knows it won't get any judicial deference on the back end. If it wants to rely on guidance documents or agency adjudications, it knows that then it's going to have the court taking a much more thorough look at the legal interpretations at the back end of the process. So basically, judicial deference becomes a carrot for the agencies to go through the trouble of all this procedural rigor. And I offer the same thing in terms of trying to solve the problem of guidance documents. We're not saying that agencies can't use guidance documents. Guidance documents are actually a great thing in many respects. It's good for the regulated parties to know what the agencies are planning to do with them. But if an agency knows that it's not going to get judicial deference for the legal interpretations contained in a guidance document, the agency might pause and think, well, let's go through notice and comment. Let's open up the process at the front end so that we know we'll get the benefits of deference at the end. Sometimes this is called, scholars call it the pay me now or pay me later principle. My favorite, though, is in this 1930s report called the Brownlow Committee, the New Deal era, they referred to it as prenatal and postnatal protections. But whatever you want to call it, there needs to be some sort of process at the front end or the back end, and if you structure it correctly, you can bring agencies in the right direction. And then just a few other quick proposals. Agency litigation is very, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of expense, and the agencies know this and they leverage this to their advantage, right? A couple of years ago, the EPA promulgated an extremely costly rule, and while the rule was winding its way through the courts, the agency was pushing the regulated industries to comply with the policy, even though the courts hadn't issued final decisions on this. And in fact, the EPA lost in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court declared the agency's rule was illegal. And the day after the issue the decision was issued by the Supreme Court, the EPA announced, well, yeah, we lost the case, but we've already they didn't say forced, we've already convinced the regulated parties to comply with these standards and put these technologies on their smokestack. So we lost the case, but the world's a better place for it. And Amazingly, that's perfectly legal. It's very hard to stop an agency from implementing a policy even while judicial review is pending. A regulated party might be able to get an injunction against the agency, but usually it can't. So in the report, I say let's flip that presumption. For the costliest rules, let's put in an automatic injunction against what the agency wants to do. Not complete injunction, leave the door open for those exceptional cases where the agency might be able to convince a court that it's a truly exceptional case where the agency should be allowed to impose its rule while judicial review is pending, but make that the exception, not the rule. So just flip that basic presumption. Or in addition to that, allow for bifurcation of judicial review. Instead of having one giant case with a bunch of issues that goes through the judicial process like a pig through a boa constrictor. I probably got that image wrong, but instead of having it all go through, why not take the sort of clear legal issues about statutory authority as an agency going outside of its lane and just fast track that through the courts right away. Allow that to get settled right away in the courts rather than having to tie in all these other issues about evidence and arbitrary and capricious rulemaking, and just settle the straightforward legal issues right away on a fast track. And then finally, for the issue of sue and settle, where an agency can receive a lawsuit from a nominally adverse party, but really it's an effort to collude between the say, public interest groups and the agency to increase the agency's regulatory power. Those things are ordinarily signed off on by district judges, and they bind the agency going forward. It's an immensely powerful tool by pro-regulatory agencies and the outside groups that support them to lock in an agency's agenda, but it really limits the rights of other affected parties. I propose that those things should be opened up like class action lawsuits, that before a court can sign off on that type of consent decree, that kind of settlement, it should be opened up for public notice, and everybody should be able to comment on it the way they'd comment on a rule. So just basically adapting class action procedures to this context. And then just one last review, because I know I've gone long, but there's often talk about retrospective review, forcing agencies to go back 5 or 10 years after they've promulgated a rule and look at whether their analysis was good, look at what the costs and benefits are today, and decide whether to eliminate that rule. I think that's an important tool, but I think it kind of misses the point, because one of the biggest problems of the modern administrative state is that the agencies and the agency staff are extremely confident in their own proposals and their own predictions and forecasts. And that's why the notice and comment process is it's so empty, really, because by the time the agency has announced its policy, its proposed policy, it already knows what it basically wants to do. And it's very hard to convince an agency in that context that its proposal is wrong. But I think retrospective review might actually help improve this. Because if an agency is forced every 5 or 10 years to go back and look at what it did in the past and really report on what it got right and what it got wrong, it might create sort of a better institutional environment of what's called, epistemic modesty? Basically humility. Reminding agencies over and over again that sometimes they get things dramatically wrong, often in the exact context in which they're still making rules going forward. And so the goal is for retrospective review isn't to tear down old regulations so much as to remind agencies that they probably should think harder about the regulations yet to come. So those are the basic proposals.
Thank you very much, Adam. Thank you all very much. I do want to open up for questions. I'll abuse my prerogative first and ask each of you a brief question. Kevin, to start with you, you ended by noting that Congress can already do all this, essentially all that you wanted to do. It has the power to do. You mentioned that in the report in the tone of it being good news. But of course, that means that the reason Congress hasn't done these things is that it doesn't want to. And so how do we actually solve this problem? How do we change what Congress wants to do, even if you give it the best advice as to what it could do? If the problem is a problem of will, what can we do about that?
Well, that's heavily going to fall on leadership. I mean, there's a lot of incentives running in the wrong direction. I mean, a member of Congress, you have all sorts of incentives which outrank paying attention to regulations. Flying back home on a regular basis, raising money, doing public relations triage. These are the duties that the modern member feels most put upon by. And then there's all the other stuff. You got to raise money for, you want a committee chair, you got to raise money and be a good party member, you got to do this, you got to do that. So how do you get people to pay attention to this topic? Well, having leadership in the chamber, each chamber that care about this topic is key. And with the current structure of Congress, they're very, very top-heavy. A lot of the power over the last 50 years has flowed upwards. And so that power can be used to kind of push downward to make things happen. Political stars have to align. I mean, as Phil Kerpen was telling me this week, it was astonishing. One of the first things that the House of Representatives did was to move, 3 full regulatory reform bills. 2 years ago, there may not have been the will. 6 years ago, there most definitely probably wasn't going to be the will. So it's factors like that, and I think also that this is one of those problems that, maybe when Nixon was in the White House, the administrative state didn't seem like such a big problem. I mean, he signed the EPA into existence, and there was a certain faith that this was technocratic or smart in some way and that this would play out fine. But over time, when you keep seeing the overreach, you keep seeing huge policies being issued like net neutrality, waters of the United States, and ending up bogged down in the federal courts, that's kind of a feedback that we're recognizing, like, you know what, this is not working out right, and we do need to correct. So I'm hoping the consciousness is coming around and political stars align, and we get, the leadership who's willing to put the time in on this.
Thanks. Oren, you suggested at the end that what you're proposing depends in a sense on what Kevin is proposing, that these things would have to be done together so that it isn't simply more empowerment of the executive branch at the expense of the others. Does that mean that the new president should wait before trying these kinds of changes? Should not use the opportunity that he will have at the beginning of a new administration to change the way regulation is done, to change the relationship between the White House and the agencies? Or would you advise the incoming administration to follow these steps now and hope that Congress responds by asserting more authority itself?
No, I think the president should go first. I think there's, with all of these things, a certain chicken and the egg problem of everyone kind of staring and looking at each other. And as Hamilton said, president has first mover advantage. Yeah. I'll assume it was Hamilton. Hamilton said everything good. Or so I've read on Twitter. The president is most easily equipped to go first here. He can literally just sign something, and once he does, you're headed down 2 possible paths. One is no one else gets their act together. And the question is, well, if that happened, would we really be worse off than we are now? And I think the answer is no, because the reality is that the president already has control over the executive branch. It would be hard to identify something that happened in the last 8 years that was not in keeping with what President Obama wanted to have happen. I think the closest you would get would be when the EPA attempted to issue the new ozone standard before he had won re-election, and that received a firm letter saying, nope, not going to let you do it. After the election, it was okay to do it, which is a discussion for another day. But in that respect, things wouldn't necessarily change that much. I don't think we create a new constitutional crisis. What would change is the way that the administrative state is managed. And so I think we make progress even if the other branches don't react. I think if we actually want to get back to an effective separation of powers with checks and balances, you need the other branches to then act. But by virtue of fully asserting authority within the executive, I think you make it more likely that that would happen.
Mm-hmm. Adam, in running a policy journal for conservatives, I've been exposed in the past few years to a strange phenomenon, which is intense interest in administrative law by a rising generation of legal scholars. But most of them don't talk about it the way you do. We get a lot of submissions on administrative law, and most of them end up suggesting that what's needed is a new kind of judge, more than a new kind of administrative law. Why is that not right? Why isn't the answer that judges ought to understand their role in the system as we now live in it as essentially redeeming our rights and protecting our rights and making sure that those rights are protected?
Well, you go to war with the judges you have, not the ones you wish you had. And that's true, especially in the context of administrative law. The last administration has now appointed a great number of judges to the D.C. Circuit, the court most responsible for regulatory appeals. And the fact is that to the extent that the sort of perfect judge for this approach is out there, they probably won't be sitting on the D.C. Circuit anytime soon. But the thing is, the D.C. Circuit, I think, is a great study for why you can't just count on judges. When President Reagan came to power in 1981, and he had campaigned on reg reform, and he had been so active in restructuring the executive branch to promote this. We have Jim Tosi here and others who were directly involved in that process of trying to reorient the modern administrative state. It ran right up against a number of judges in the D.C. Circuit who were doing everything possible to stop the Reagan administration from reorienting regulatory policy. There was one judge, a prominent judge, a Carter appointee, who later said, we thought of ourselves as trustees for Congress's past. And that's true to some extent, but that court, those judges seemed especially eager to block regulatory reform. And the fact is, that's what doctrines like Chevron deference and other things arose in response to. Those doctrines about decreasing judicial review were advanced in support of a deregulatory process, deregulatory policy agenda. And that works great when you have the right judges there, I suppose, but those judges aren't there forever. And so now you have this interesting phenomenon where conservatives seeking a deregulatory agenda are criticizing the exact doctrines that just 30 years ago were really constructed by other conservatives, or sometimes the same conservatives, in service of a deregulatory agenda at the time. And so I think at the end of the day, the goal really has to be to come up with structures and incentives between the agencies and the courts that help the agencies do their best work regardless of who the judges and the agencies are. And then again, the goal being that all of it will be more directly tied to the people.
Let's open up for questions. I'm sure folks here have plenty.
We have
Please,
microphones.
there's a microphone going around. Tell us who you are and a brief question.
Yeah. Hi, Phil Kirpin, American Commitment. I can't help but observe that we have three panelists, one for each of the constitutional branches, but we have no chair for the independent regulatory commissions, and their status remains somewhat indeterminate between those branches. What should we do about those? Should they be collapsed into the executive branch subject to OIRA review? Should they be made more expressly congressional in character and be part of that stable of expertise that you suggest, Kevin? Or is there some other option? Whether the Independent Regulatory Commission.
Well, we ran a great essay on this in National Affairs by Adam White, so maybe Adam will start.
Well, those agencies were often called the headless fourth branch. We tried to arrange for a headless fourth speaker, but we couldn't find one. I'm in favor of the executive branch asserting more power over independent agencies. I mean, in fact, that was bounced around at the outset of the Reagan administration, and the Office of Legal Counsel drafted an opinion that said nothing in the Constitution stops the president from asserting the exact same authority over the Securities and Exchange Commission that he would over the EPA. They held back for political purposes. They thought they were already biting off quite a lot. So I do think that the executive branch should assert much more power over the independent commissions. But at the same time, I think, again, that's in the context of all three branches asserting more power over independent commissions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I would add, I kind of have a cheap parenthetical in my chapter that says, beyond the scope of this report, but to the extent that the constitutional issue comes down in favor of the executive, certainly the president should assert that authority over the commissions. And my view is that it clearly does, that you can't, it's impossible to delegate something into there are no other articles in the Constitution. If you are delegating it into Article 2, then the president must have the removal power. And if he has the removal power, then everything else would flow from that. That will have to be tested at some point. Firing Rob Cordray would be a good place to start. But my assumption is that eventually that you can just work under that assumption until it gets tested. And when it does get tested, you're likely to win. But that you can actually get an awful lot of the way there by just asserting the authority in the first place.
One last thing, though, since you've all mentioned the article. I mean, the point of my article was that these independent commissions, independent agencies, were already more or less doing the bidding of the executive branch, right? The FCC is independent, but nobody doubted that the net neutrality rule reflected President Obama's agenda.
Kevin Martin did some things that didn't reflect Bush's. And I think there's an asymmetry.
Yeah.
They seem to only be independent during the Republican administration. They seem to be perfectly in line with the administration wishes during Democratic administration.
I mean, I guess maybe that's a fair point, but I guess the point of my article is, and I don't think it's conflicts with what you're saying, is the presidents already assert that authority over these independent agencies when they want to. So let's make it official, and so that presidents are held accountable for the things these agencies do. I'm sorry, Kevin.
No, I was just going to throw in that I guess we're unanimous on this, that I find the basic premise of an independent agency of the executive branch kind of offensive. It's saying, here's an area of policy which is way too important for political people to be involved with. Which, it's like, excuse me, Department of defense policy is not that important. What is so privileged about these areas of policy? And moreover, the operating assumption that they're somehow going to be apolitical, aseptic, purely expert-led, et cetera, that's just naive. So why have them in this kind of separate silo where they're able to have much more freedom? It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So yeah, I would favor just making them standard executive agencies.
As I listened to the discussion of the current condition of the administrative state, the thought occurred to me that here we have Woodrow Wilson at last victorious. Is it a fair assessment to say that the current crisis of the administrative state is the culmination of the Wilsonian vision that progressivism, technocracy could know public welfare better than the people themselves?
Yes?
Yes.
Yeah, certainly I would say that's true. And in my chapter I have a little quote from John Stuart Mill, and this sort of image of expert-led government, insulated from political pressures, free to devise purely wise policy. That's an idea that goes way back, but it was kind of really injected into our federal system by Wilson. It certainly was percolating elsewhere in the states, Wisconsin, for example, and other places. So it was popping up here and there, but certainly you give credit where credit's due.
I would add one other thing, which is that, I think there's kind of been, unfortunately, we've gotten to where we are because of a conflation of two different concepts of regulatory decision making. And if you take, say, tightening the ozone standard, clean air standard as an example, there are two questions here. One is, should we be tightening the ozone clean air standard? The second question is, if we want less ozone, how do we write the rule to do that? The first of those is a political decision. There's no amount of kind of cost-benefit analysis and externalities and everything else is going to tell you whether the right policy decision for the U.S. right now is to tighten our ozone standard. But we've, by virtue of the congressional delegation, treated that as part of the technical assessment. And I think that's where we've gone over the line. If you could back that out and say the decision of whether to regulate is fundamentally political, then you could actually be somewhere I suspect we would all be comfortable with is, yeah, you actually want an anonymous technocratic bureaucrat writing the details of that rule. But right now we've left the full political part of the decision there as well.
Ken Masugi, Claremont Institute. I'd like to raise a kind of meta question that follows on Ron Bird's previous question, and that is, should we look at the administrative state as a kind of regime change? Or can we deal with it by appointing better judges, a better person at OMB, et cetera, et cetera? Obviously, you can attack on all fronts, but I think in trying to deal with the problem, I think if you look at it in terms of a regime change, the sorts of approaches you take toward it, what you require of the political branches, and whom you appoint to the Supreme Court, are all going to be considered differently and far more radically.
Well, I do think, I mean, in the first instance, personnel is extremely important in all three branches. And in the short term, people, individual officials and appointments can have a huge impact on this, whether it's a fifth vote in the Supreme Court to actually follow through on some of the administrative law changes that have been bubbling up, or the right person in OIRA to actually take the kind of proactive approach, at least some of the steps that Oren advocates, that could be hugely important. But I do think at the end of the day, it's going to take structural reform from Congress. And in terms of regime change, I mean, in terms of the idea of regime, and what I think is really fascinating about this, and I alluded to it earlier, is it all begins with Congress. It all began with Congress giving power to the agencies. But I think it's become this really terrible feedback loop where the more power Congress has given to agencies, the more just the incentive structure in Congress and elsewhere has changed, and has given all the more reason for Congress to just punt on issues and either do nothing, creating a policy vacuum that agencies choose to fill, or basically crafting legislative compromises that are so wide open that it gives the agencies still more power. And it seems to just keep building and building upon itself to a point where I think it does take fundamental reform, which has to begin with Congress, and maybe now we have the political incentives to do this.
Yeah, I would add one other thing. Sorry, I always add one other thing. One of the things I think is a real strength of this report is that the process started at a time when no one had any idea who was going to be the next president. I would say a lot of the drafting was done at a time when everyone assumed Hillary Clinton would be the next president. And now Donald Trump is going to be the next president. And I think I speak for all three of us when I say none of the recommendations in here changed at any point as a result of that. Yeah. That I think if the administrative state fight is not about the Clean Power Plan. The Clean Power Plan is a good illustration of a symptom, but it's 100 years fight that has brought us to here, and it will be 100 years fight over how government evolves. And so I think the types of reforms that we need to focus on are, first of all, ones that don't care who actually holds the reins of power, and second of all, ones that maybe some people on the left might agree with. Certainly when faced with a Trump administration, but even if a Clinton administration were incoming, how can we move toward a system that says whatever it is the people are voting for, that actually is how government looks?
Just add in, I really like the characterization as a form of regime change. A lot of political theory, regime change thinking looked at it, governments by their kind of, almost like cocktails. What do they have in them? What are their component pieces? And over the last 100 years, we've moved from a heavily legislative-centric American national government to one that's heavily executive-centric. And that's been hugely propelled by the sheer gigantism of the executive branch, which Congress is utterly to blame for, or to credit, I suppose, depending on how you feel about it. And so when you think about how it's switched, we've moved from a system where policy outputs were largely driven by an elected legislature to one where policy outputs are maybe even mostly driven by unelected kind of technocrat executive branch. There's a qualitative shift there. And so I guess it kind of circles back to my contention is that if you want to kind of get the cocktails blend right, you got to put back more legislative substance into it.
A plug for your moonshine, bro?
Right. More
Don't
gin.
put moonshine into it, Lord no.
So this discussion has been a little too kumbaya for me.
Excellent.
I want a little more thinking about conflict in our near future. It strikes me that when we think about ambition must be made to counteract ambition, that isn't a matter of holding hands and envisioning the right policy framework that we want to get to. It's a matter of institutions deciding that they need to fight for their own prerogatives that have been that are in danger or have been seized by the other branches. And so it strikes me that on the one hand, it's appealing to say you didn't need to change much in this report based on who won the presidency, but one of the reasons that's plausible to me is because you might be able to think of a lot of conflict between the branches in both a Clinton administration and a Trump administration. So in that case, that would make it somewhat different from much of the Bush 43 administration, in which Congress and the administration really were remarkably close collaborators in a lot of ways. So I just wondering if one or more of you could speculate about the kinds of conflicts and the occasions for conflict that we're likely to see that could drive this process of reform.
Mm-hmm. Oren, do you expect conflict between the branches now?
I think there's going to be a lot of substantive policy conflict between the branches on legislative issues, which is actually, I think, going to somewhat shift the balance. I think the Obama administration was really characterized by a fairly docile Congress kind of whining in the wings as the agencies did whatever they wanted. And it seems like we're starting down a path of Congress having an awful lot it's planning to do in the next 12 months, about which the White House is already kind of whining. And obviously, the White House can whine more loudly than Congress can. But that is going to be a very interesting tension. It's going to be, though, frankly, a little bit different, I think, than the one that we're talking about here. I think to get the kind of conflict that you're describing, you would need Trump agencies doing things that Congress wanted to fight about. I don't see a lot of areas for that. I don't know if you guys do.
I'm not sure how many substantive policy disputes are going to come up and how quickly they're going to come up between the presidency and the legislature, but I'm absolutely certain that within Congress itself, particularly the Senate, the brawls are going to be many. Simply changing anything, even the most banal, obvious thing, is no easy lift in the Senate. And so when you start talking about scaling back the administrative state and reasserting, Congress and regulatory policy making, there are going to be a lot of people who are freaked out by this, because you are moving their cheese. You are creating what they think is a new normal, because their operating assumption has been, well, no, regulators regulate, and we kind of keep an occasional eye on them and look for a GAO report, or if an interest group flags something that troubles us, then maybe we'll look into it. But for the most part, it's not our job. Those sorts of things start changing as those proposals move through Congress. Then, wow, there are going to be a lot of brawls within the Congress, and particularly the Senate.
Yeah, on the administrative law stuff, hopefully, and it seems, since that seems to be some of the laws that are the legislation is first out of the gate, that obviously will require agreement between the executive branch and the legislative branch to get it through. It seems to be a place where there's broad agreement. I hope it gets through, because I do think there's going to be a lot of fight within Congress and then between Congress and the president over some of these substantive statutes. If there's going to be any kind of reform of the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Communications Act, Telecommunications Act, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, any of these statutes that have been sort of elevated in public debate in the context of the administrative state and are going to be hashed out, the prospects of reform, there's going to be immense disagreement. And there might not be, it might be too heavy a lift to get those statutes tweaked or changed. And so I hope that at the very least the Administrative Procedure Act gets adjusted at the very outset to provide rules for the road going forward. At this point, you might get that through just through mutual suspicion of the administrative agencies by both the executive branch and the legislative branch. That might be, even in a context of conflict, and I think there will be conflict, one of the things that they'll agree upon.
The question really raises something very fundamental about the kinds of arguments that you advance here. I think Philip is suggesting that there are certain constitutional muscles that are just out of use, and in a sense that the core of the traditional constitutional system strikes the people who are populating it as sort of strange. I'm always struck in hearing it by an experience I had working in the Bush White House, where in 2006, Congress was going to send the president a bill he didn't like about stem cell research, and we had a little meeting, and Bush confirmed to everybody that he wanted to veto it, and everyone started to get up to leave, and he said, so a veto, what do I get a document? What do we actually do? And everyone looked at each other and realized we were 6 years into the Bush presidency, and this would be his first veto, the first time he ever used the veto pen. And it was. He ended up doing that. And we literally had to bring in people from OMB to explain to us what's involved in a veto. What do we get from Congress? What do we send them back? Is there a message? That kind of atrophy is a model of what goes wrong when the branches are not ambitious in that way, when they're not ambitious against one another. And in a sense, you're arguing for a more competitive constitutional system, but in order to get there, you're suggesting there has to be some agreement about the need for it.
Yeah, I mean, on that, by the way, so oftentimes in the context of the administrative agencies, the assumption is that the agencies of the executive branch are reaching out and grabbing the turf that properly belongs to Congress. And I guess that's true sometimes or at the margins, but it really is wrong. I mean, this is stuff Congress has shoveled power at the agencies years and years and years. There's a great book on war power by John Hart Ely, the Democrat, the liberal of the 1960s and 1970s, where in the context of war power says it's often assumed that the problem here is the executive branch taking power away from the Congress, but actually it's the opposite. Congress has just handed all this over because it doesn't want to be accountable for the policy decisions that are made. And so that's the other real muscle that's atrophied here is a will to really legislate meaningful standards. Congress is so used to just handing this over to agencies. Even in the last administration, the two most significant legislative achievements of the Obama administration were the Dodd-Frank Act and the Affordable Care Act, both of which basically set up structures for other people to make the policy judgments as insulated as possible from Congress itself. And so the incentives have been there over and over again, and Naomi Rao of George Mason has written a great article about why some of the incentives have just been wrong for Congress. And I think what it really takes, the only hope for real reform is this exogenous shock, this shock from the outside that suddenly changes people's incentives. And again, that's one of the reasons why, even when I was a pretty outspoken critic of the president-elect throughout the campaign, one of the optimistic points here, I think, is he was that exogenous shock who might actually provide the motive for Congress to get moving on this.
Let's take one more question in the back.
Hi, thank you very much. This is excellent. I think the agencies have all the staff and all the resources, and Congress clearly doesn't. The staff moves around a lot. The bosses are too busy. I would agree that there needs to be a better quality and more of the knowledge base on the Congress. They've used maybe Chevron among the staff and the members as a kind of placebo for sort of legislation deficit disorder, and they almost count on it being there in some ways. I'm not comfortable, given that NPRMs have become a high art form at some of the, especially independent agencies, where a commission removed from the elected Congress delegates to its staff that has a high policy bias, almost an industrial policy bias, with no free market, often at times, however innocent, attitude, that conducts no benefit cost because it's not required under the executive orders or by law. And they have a tendency then to innocently or very diabolically pick winners and losers in the marketplace with this bias. Then they roll in with NPRMs that are already pre-decided, as you yourself, Adam, said, and so the result is that it's all done, and then the only bite at the apple anyone gets in the public is at the appellate level. If it's going to be pre-wired 2 steps away from Congress with the decision already being made, then I'd like to go into the district circuit level at the very least and get 2 bites at the apple. Other than that, I say no to continuing Chevron deference at the NPRM level. Thank you.
I mean, in that, I want to say there's a great study that came out recently by a couple of law professors, Kent Barnett and Chris Walker, where they go and they interviewed all sorts of agency staff and asked them about what sort of judicial rules of deference and other judicial rules they have in mind when they're drawing up these regulations. And the one that they all knew about and they all focused on was Chevron deference. The agency staff themselves, as they worked through these processes, were aware of the fact that if they did it one way, they'd get deference from the courts, and it does just totally transform the project within the agency, just as these incentives of the administrative state really transform what happens in Congress.
If I could just riff on your mention of Congress and capacity, you probably know, well, you may very well know that when Congress needs help, it can't reach to GAO for the most part. GAO is responsive to committee heads. It can provide some ad hoc help, if you know somebody over there who works an area and they want to spend the time to work with you one-on-one. So That's not there as much of a resource for the individual member of Congress trying to understand something. Congressional Budget Office, they're limited to budget stuff. Congressional Research Service, there are 2 people at Congressional Research Service who cover regulation and rulemaking. 2. Maybe 3 if you want to count an attorney who does admin law and kind of goes part-time to help on that area, last I checked. But yeah, that's what you have. And again, with the great flow of rules coming on so many different issue areas, how's Congress possibly going to keep up?
We seem to have discovered a problem to which the solution is more congressional staff. Things are dire indeed. Thank you all very much. Great discussion. Let's thank our panel and.